Hello everyone, Alpha from the World Times, and today we're going to be discussing Iraq. We're going to be talking about the current crisis in that country, what happened there, what's the crisis all about, and you're going to get some really interesting facts that you haven't gotten before. Because the current events in that country are pretty complex and fast evolving, this video isn't really aimed to give you who's right, who's wrong, and anything like that. It's just going to give you a good idea of what's happening there and what led up to the events. Because, as I said earlier, the events are pretty complex and are happening. We're going to be splitting up this report into three parts. The first part is basically telling you what happened, what led up to the events, and things like that. The second part is going to be an in-depth analysis where we will discuss the various sides and things like that. And the third and final part covers concluding words and our final thoughts. So get ready and enjoy. Alright everybody, before we get actually started, let's just get a little bit background on Iraq to really give you an idea of what the country is about and how everything really started. We have added, before we get started, we have added certain new features to our videos, like the timeline which you see now. That's really gonna help you to understand the events and make it easier for you and for us to show you what's going on. So, uh, Before Iraq was a country, it had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire for several centuries, and it was called Mesopotamia. We don't know what it means, but we think it means the line between the two rivers. In World War I, the Ottoman Empire loses, and Britain and France split up the Middle East between them. So Britain gets Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, and other places, while the French get Syria and Lebanon and some parts of Turkey. Moving on. So this pact was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and this is really it split up the places into different places. Back before that, there were no borders. There were like people termed themselves as Syrians and Arabs and things like that, but there were no real borders, so you could go from Baghdad to Mosul or Aleppo without any trouble. Moving on. So after World War One and with the split and all that stuff, after 10 years later, around 1932 or 33, Iraq becomes a kingdom ruled by a Hashemite king. Basically, these guys were British allies, but they kind of lost a power struggle in Saudi Arabia, so um, Britain gave them their own kingdom in Iraq and Jordan. Now, during the kingdom period, Iraq was stable but politically unstable, and instability tended to surface from time to time, and the British intervened and even fought a war to keep their guys in power, kind of. And Iraq almost became a Nazi ally in World War II. So, skipping World War II to 1985, and the king is overthrown and his entire royal family is kind of killed. They're all dead, yeah. So, it's kind of like ever since then, Iraq's history has been really written in blood. One guy kills the other guy to gain power, kind of like with al-Maliki and Saddam, etc., etc. So moving on. So at this time, by the time the monarchy is gone and a republic is proclaimed by Abdul Karim Qasim, Iraq was stable but poor and underdeveloped. Most of the oil money went to oil companies. So this guy was kind of a socialist. He was kind of like pan-Arab with Gamal Abdel Nasser, another guy who ruled Egypt. So Abdul Karim Qasim begins reforming the country, nationalizing the industry, and really trying to improve the quality of life in the country. Overall, he was probably one of the best leaders Iraq had in a very long time compared with the current stock. But the guy kind of tended to get involved in different things politically, like in foreign policy, and this results in him getting overthrown and killed, like the king. One guy overthrows the other guy, etc. So, moving on. So, Abdul Karim Qasim gets overthrown, and another guy comes to power called Ahmed Hassan al Bakr. He's basically a socialist, a Ba'athist, a pan Arabist, things like that. But he kind of stays away from foreign policy mostly, otherwise intervening in a war with Israel, against Israel, that is. And then by the 70s, he continues to improve Iraq. The economy is booming. Basically, the country is really great. It was under his leadership that the country wasn't its best. So, but by then, around the 70s, he was in a power struggle with Saddam Hussein. He was, in fact, Saddam's cousin. Yikes, I know. Alright, so moving on. So Saddam becomes president in 1988, and and with the Shah gone in Iran, he kind of gets into a war with Iran to gain some new territory. But that doesn't end well. Iraq gets in a quagmire that lasts for 8 years, and it was this 20th century's longest conventional war, longer than World War One and longer and World War Two. So basically, it's like that now. So after that, in after Iran, Saddam invades Kuwait because of some debt repayment, and he kind of wants Kuwait back. But this time, the Americans decide to intervene, and Saddam is pushed out of Kuwait, and the Americans establish a no-fly zone against Iraq. Basically, it means no military aircraft can hover certain areas in the north to protect the Kurds. But there were multiple uprisings against him, and so skipping to 2003, Saddam is overthrown by the Bush administration, part of the global war on terror, after he deemed Iraq a part of the axis of evil. Now, after that, after Saddam is overthrown, captured, executed, blah blah blah, 2006, al-Maliki becomes prime minister of Iraq after he's seen as a compromise candidate. And so by this time, the country is really, really in a bad shape. Suicide bombings, car bombings, open battles are there. And so in 2007, um, 2009, around that time, the Americans begin a surge. Basically, they increase the amounts of troops in the country and really begin to wind down. The violence begins to wind down. They also form alliances with anti-Al Qaeda groups, because now there was Al Qaeda in Iraq, or ISIS. Basically, it was the group that would become ISIS later on. They also controlled huge parts of Ramadi and Fallujah. Now, moving on. So 2009, Barack Obama is elected, and he becomes the president of the United States. So by this time, the Iraqis and the Americans had an agreement whereby U.S. troops would stay for a few more years until 2011, but they also agreed to negotiate. So skipping on till 2011, the Americans and the Iraqis failed to negotiate because there's a dispute about the immunity agreement or something along those lines, and the terms the Americans offer to the Iraqis, like it requires a huge majority for the Iraqi parliament so that the US can continue having troops. It's pretty complicated, and we're not going to get into it. Moving on. So now, 2011, December, Iraq is on its own. There are no more American troops other than those guarding the embassy and things like that. Now, by 2011, as you can see on the map, the last American troops had withdrawn. From that time till January, December, no, December 2013, January 2014, you get a lot of protests against al-Maliki, especially in the Sunni areas like in Anbar, Fallujah, because they're really not happy with al-Maliki, and he becomes to get authoritarian, replacing people, giving benefits to the Kurds, giving free all to all other people, and so they decide to protest and set up camps in different places. This is December 2013, January 2014. Now, this is really when things get bad. So, in order to appease the protesters, al-Maliki withdraws all security forces from Fallujah and Ramadi. But in a twist of irony for those guys who said in Fallujah they can defend their own, ISIS, also called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria by that time, is had a lot of territory in Syria and was really becoming a rising power. Not the monster that it is today, but it was becoming close to it. So they took huge parts of the area, and they really began to set a foothold, trapping the Iraqis' best units in a pointless war in that area. Hit and run attacks, car bombings, suicide bombings, basically tricking the Iraqis into thinking that Fallujah was the main real ground, while they gained power and influence in Syria. And in 2013, earlier that year, they had seized Raqqa, a city in eastern Syria along the Euphrates River. So this was really becoming their capital. This was by that time the largest city ruled by Al Qaeda. So that's basically half of it, and we're gonna move on. Now, by as we said, so now we've covered two of the main events that happened in Thailand. So, and by this time also, ISIS was also attacking prisons in Baghdad and the really dangerous areas and taking out prisoners. Really, so they were launching heists, all that stuff. Now, moving on. So, in April of 2014, with most of the Iraqi army still in Mosul fighting and dragged into really nitty gritty bad things. There were a general election in which no party won the majority of seats, but Al Maliki's bloc did emerge as the single largest winners. But they didn't have enough votes to really make them allow them to form a government in the country. Now, Al Maliki was caretaker prime minister, and as this happened, uh, politicians started fighting among themselves. You know how these things go. Now, moving on. So, by June of 2014, in mid-June that is, ISIS attacked Samarra. It's basically an important city along the in central Iraq. That's really important because it's got a Shiite shrine there, and that shrine got blown up last time, and that what really started tensions in the country in 2006 2007. Now moving on, so the scale of the ISIS attacks shocks a lot of people, and but no one anticipated that they would attack Mosul, and that happened on June 6th. So basically, Mosul attacks with 1,500 fighters, and over the next 2 days, capture the entire city. 30,000 Iraqi soldiers desert their positions. Well, you can't call the Iraqi cowards. I mean, sure, 30,000 soldiers against 1,500 guys. Come on, that is cowardness, but not really. There were there were a lot of unconfirmed reports of what really happened, but word on the street is it's the military commanders who deserted, not the soldiers themselves. In fact, there are some reports which say that some Iraqi units fought on. This is from coming from the New York Times and etc. Now moving on. So with the fall of Mosul, the country goes in a panic. 500,000 civilians from Mosul leave the area because everyone knows these guys are bad in Syria and etc. Now moving, okay. So as this happens, ISIS over the next few weeks advances and captures a lot more territory in shocking speed. So why is ISIS successful? Let's do a little bit of analysis here. Number one, ISIS wasn't just in there. There is a lot of discontent against al-Maliki. In fact, northern Iraq, certain area around it is called the Sunni Triangle. People really don't like Shias being governing them, and they don't like al-Maliki. Also, Ba'athist loyalists and other groups joined in the assault. So ISIS may have led the attack, but it wasn't just ISIS that was running the show. There are other groups there. Now, as this happens, things get really nasty, and ISIS continues to expand, capturing Tikrit and Beiji, or some of Beiji, which is the largest oil facility in Iraq, and other places. In fact, they reach the outskirts of Baghdad, or are very close to it, and things like that. So by moving on, by like early August, ISIS has captured half the country, or half the north of the country, and most of the west is under its control. That's a lot of places. Now, they even captured several border crossings around Iraq and Syria. In fact, the Iraqi government has lost control over its border crossings in Iraq and Syria, most of them, that is. And so now moving on to August, ISIS launches an attack on the Kurds. So Kurdistan has been pretty much the successful. So as I was saying, ISIS basically now attacks Kurdistan. We don't really know why they attack the Kurds, but one interesting fact to note is that Kurdish units basically prevented the Iraqi army from entering northern Kurdistan when Mosul fell, or some of it. Now, the irony is ISIS is attacking Kurdistan and the Kurds aren't really well prepared. Uh, so as this happens, several areas in the north, like between the Syrian border and Iraq, there are a lot of ethnic minorities like Turkmen, Shabak, and Yazidis. And ISIS is targeting them because they're not they're infidels or whatever, something along those lines. And in terms of ISIS, you're either with us or you're against us. They're pretty much um, the Khmer Rouge of the Islamic extremists. That's what they are. They're nuts. Uh, when ISIS attacked Kurdistan, they were pretty close to getting to Erbil, but they were prevented by American airstrikes. But however, at the same time, they launched an attack in northern Iraq in an area in several towns called Sinjar. This results in thousands of people fleeing the area, but 40,000 of those people called Yazidis. It's an ethnic minority, and they're hetero-Orthodox Kurdish groups. Basically, they are Kurds, but they don't follow the same religion or culture. They're Yazidis. We can't actually talk about them because we don't have enough time, but moving on. So forcing 40,000 of these people flee to safety or just survival in nearby mountains, which are really hard to survive in. And that's you guys pretty much up to date on the current events in Iraq. Of course, we can't cover everything, and we're not trying to cover everything because it's too long, too hard, and too complicated. So let's start with our in-depth analysis. Right, let's analyze what happened. What did go wrong? Well, why did 90,000 or 30,000 Iraqi soldiers, depending on who you hear from, desert their positions? Well, we don't, as I said earlier, we don't really know what happened. Who knows? Maybe there was an agreement between the local area. Second of all, word on the street is that ISIS had been operating openly in Mosul for a very long time. So who knows? It might have been just them being reinforced. Third of all, Iraq is not a stable country, as a Fox journalist put it, and you're about to see the Americans left Iraq as a country not able to survive, to stand on its own. It was even after America left, and despite the surge, Iraq was constantly facing car bombings, suicide bombings, and attack daily. The level of violence is pretty dangerous, with dozens of people dying every day. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem in Iraq is that there's a lot of mistrust of the politicians and the different ethnic groups. So that's why things are hard. Now they are making some effort, but it's not enough. Also, to make things worse for Iraq is the ongoing political crisis, as al-Maliki has just got his ass handed to him a few days ago, but he's refusing to step down. This is after a lot of guys from his own party defected and chose another guy as prime minister. So al-Maliki is not withdrawing, and this is really bad because it gives parallels to Iraq, to Vietnam, and the same crises that resulted in America coming in, because the Diem, I think that's his name, that guy kind of was also bad like al-Maliki, and he got killed, which threw South Vietnam in political crisis and eventually resulted in North Vietnamese victory. So that's our analysis. It's not really easy to analyze something like this, but we've given you an idea of what's going on. We've given you who the major players are and things like that. Now, that's basically our analysis. And to conclude this certainly was not an easy report to do because of its size. And also, we can't really get every different type of information, so we've just chosen the mainstream stuff, and we wanted to really cover and give you guys a good idea of what's going on. We hope we did that. Thank you very much for tuning in, and join us next time for another World Times report.